Hey, I'm Seth Williams from REtipster.com, and today we're going to talk about comparables, or comps for short. If you've ever made an offer to purchase real estate, there's a good chance you spent at least a little bit of time looking around at other similar properties in the area to figure out what a reasonable offer price would be, right? When you look around at these other similar properties in the area, what you're looking at is known in the real estate industry as comparables, or comps for short. Comps are used as measuring tools to help us determine the fair market value of a property, and they're used by a lot of different people in a real estate transaction, including sellers, buyers, real estate agents, lenders, and appraisers, and they all rely on them heavily to figure out what a property is worth. The appraiser's determination of the property's value has a big impact on the bank's decision to lend money, because if the property isn't actually worth what the borrower wants to pay for it, it could be putting the bank at risk of overextending themselves on the loan. But when you're looking at comps for the purpose of trying to estimate a property's value, there's one big underlying problem we have to acknowledge. In a perfect world, a comparable property would be 100% identical to your subject property in every conceivable way. But the unfortunate reality is that no two properties are exactly alike. Every property has differences from the ones around it. Everything from the land it sits on, to the location of the property, to the condition of the interior and the exterior, the age of the property, and a whole lot more. Even so, you can usually find at least a few comparable properties that are similar enough to the property you're evaluating to be reasonably accurate at evaluating your property. When trying to find good comps, there's a number of key things that you're going to want to look for. Recently sold properties. In order for a comp to be valid, you need to know what price it's sold for, and it should have been sold within the past 12 months. And if the market is changing rapidly, you might even want to narrow that down to 6 months. The more recent the sale, the better the information, especially in a rapidly changing market. Nearby locations. The location of the comps that you're using should be as close to the subject property as possible. When you're looking for comps in an urban area, they should be within the same neighborhood or at least in the neighborhoods nearby. Assuming the nearby neighborhood has properties of a similar size, age, and condition. And it usually does make a difference to stay within the same school district and zip code. In a suburban location, comps should be within a mile of the subject property, but they can be up to 3 miles away. Possibly even further if you're in a rural area where there simply aren't any nearby comps. Size. Good comps should be of a similar square footage and/or acreage to the subject property and have the same number of bedrooms and bathrooms as the subject property. Property type. If you're trying to figure out the value of a single-family home, don't compare it to a multi-family property or a condo. Features and upgrades. Good comparables should also have similar features and upgrades to the subject property that you're trying to evaluate. For example, a fixer-upper would not be a good comparable for a newly constructed property. Number of comps. Having more than just one comparable is usually a pretty good idea. 3 to 4 comparables are usually sufficient, assuming the comps are appropriate for the property you're evaluating. And this is actually a really big deal to pick the right comps, because if you pick the wrong ones, it can completely mess up the value that you're trying to determine for your property. Arm's length transactions. This means the buyer and seller had no prior relationship. They weren't family members, they weren't friends, and the sale price between them is actually an accurate portrayal of that property's market value. It wasn't discounted, or there wasn't special favor given from one party to the other. We actually have a whole other video explaining all the differences between arm's length and non-arm's length transactions. I'll be sure to link to it here in this video if you want to go check that out. So once you've got all the relevant details figured out about your property, like the location, the size, the bedrooms and bathrooms, and so on, then you can go on a website like Zillow or Realtor.com and start plugging in those similar features and characteristics and search for similar properties that have sold within the past 6 to 12 months. And you'll start finding them pretty quick that way. And remember, since no two properties are exactly alike, you're probably going to have to make some tiny adjustments to account for those differences you find between your property and the comparable properties that you find. For example, if your subject property has a wraparound porch worth somewhere around $8,000, but all the comparable properties that you're finding don't have any porches of any kind, or definitely not the kind that your subject property has, you could make that adjustment pretty easily by just taking that $8,000 value and then adding it to the value of those comparable properties that you found. Or likewise, if that same comparable property had a pool worth $30,000, but your subject property does not have a pool, then $30,000 could be subtracted from the comparable property. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we're on this whole topic of finding comparable properties, and particularly sold comps, is that in most states in the US, it's not too difficult to find these kinds of sold comparable properties on websites like Zillow or Realtor.com or a number of other similar websites. But there are some states out there called non-disclosure states. And in these non-disclosure states, the recent sale prices of comparable properties are not available to the public. Only licensed realtors have access to this data through the MLS in their market. So if you're trying to find sold comps like this in a non-disclosure state, you're probably going to need to get assistance from a licensed agent who has access to the MLS and can get this data for you. What if you can't find any comps for your property in your area, either because you're in a non-disclosure state or because the comps simply don't exist? There are no similar properties that match your property close enough. Well, another option is to use listing prices instead of sold prices. These numbers are going to be a lot less useful because the listing price of a property could be a whole lot higher than its true market value, because that number is a reflection of what the seller hopes to get, not what they're actually going to get. Listing prices can also be lower than true market value too, reflecting a lowball price if the seller is trying to start a bidding war or sell the property really quickly. So a listing price is definitely not the most accurate measure of a property's true market value. But again, if the sold comps in your area simply don't exist, you may have no other option than to just use what little information you have available and then make adjustments to account for that margin between the asking prices and the selling prices in your area. It's also important to remember that sold comps are technically a reflection of the past, not what's happening today. In order to understand the current market, an appraiser has to take a look at comparable pending sales to understand what buyers are willing to pay right now. In a rapidly increasing market, one might see pending sales getting bid up at higher prices, while in a declining market, one could also see listings not entering into a contract at all. Ordering an appraisal from a licensed appraiser is usually the most reliable way to figure out your property's current market value, but the problem with an appraisal is appraisals cost money and time, and sometimes this can be problematic, especially if you're a real estate investor and you're trying to make a dozen offers a day. It doesn't make sense to try to get appraisals on every single property before you understand the value well enough to make an offer. You need a faster way so you can do this right now on your own. And it's also important to understand that even an appraisal isn't guaranteed to be perfect or accurate. When I used to work in banking, I remember seeing commercial appraisals come out sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars different from one appraiser versus another appraiser, simply because they were looking at different comparable properties to come up with their valuation. So the comps that you decide to use will absolutely have a huge impact on whatever appraised value you or your appraiser come up with. Using good, appropriate comparables can absolutely be an effective way for you to figure out property values at no cost to you, as long as you understand what makes an appropriate comp for your property and you know how to make the necessary adjustments so it reflects the most appropriate comparison. Do you want to learn more about how to find good comparables in your market? Be sure to check out the full article over at retipster.com. I'll be sure to link to it beneath this video. And if you want to expand your real estate knowledge, be sure to check out this next video, and I'll see you there. Hallelujah! We're done.